as MPP or Remain in Mexico, the policy's history in the courts, with the special emphasis on its current journey in the Supreme Court of the United States and where it stands currently. We will also learn about the impact of MPP's reimplementation and describe the true costs of the policy. We will have some time towards the end of the hour to answer your questions. Joining me today to provide their insight and expertise on the topic are Marisol Castro, Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, and Cecilia Suarez. Aaron Reichlin-Melnick will be speaking on the policy's litigation, is a senior policy counsel at the American Immigration Council. Aaron works primarily on immigration court issues and the intersection of immigration law and policy. Aaron holds a JD from the Georgetown University Law Center and a BA in Politics and East Asian Studies from Brandeis University. In addition, we will be hearing from Marisol Castro and Cecilia Suarez, who are both on the ground and can speak to the realities of MPP. Marisol Castro works with the Diocesan Migrant and Refugee Services in El Paso, Texas, otherwise known as DMRS. Marisol is the managing attorney of the Removal Defense Unit. She's been practicing law for 13 years and received her JD from the Southern California Institute of Law in Santa Barbara. Prior to joining DMRS, Marisol started her career at the Santa Barbara Public Defender's Office for 3 years before opening her own private practice as a criminal defense attorney. She now represents asylum seekers, migrants in ICE detention centers, those waiting in Mexico under MPP, migrants who were expelled from the US under Title 42, and also assisted with the response to Afghan evacuee arrivals. Finally, we will hear from Cecilia Suarez of Catholic Relief Services Mexico. Cecilia Suarez is the head of CRS's efforts in Mexico and has worked with vulnerable populations, from at-risk youth and street children in Mexico to migrants and refugees in Mexico and other countries, always with a focus on building peace and social cohesion. She believes in promoting networks between faith-based organizations to build strategic alliances and collective capacity building communities of practice that strengthen the capacity of the Catholic Church to respond to a diversity of humanitarian crises. She studied food chemistry in the National Autonomous University of Mexico and has a degree in not-for-profit organizations management. She lives in Mexico City with her family. I want to take this opportunity to thank our speakers for taking the time to be with us today. Before jumping into the discussion, I will give just a brief overview of the policy at hand. As you may know, the Migrant Protection Protocols was implemented under the Trump administration in January of 2019. Under the policy, the US government returned certain asylum seekers to Mexico to wait through the duration of their immigration cases in the US immigration court system. In June of 2021, the Biden administration attempted to terminate the policy, but was met with litigation and ordered to continue implementing MPP in good faith. This has come to be known as the reimplementation, or MPP 2.0. The decision was appealed and a second termination memo was issued in October of 2021. The administration petitioned the US Supreme Court to review the lower court's decision, and oral arguments were heard on April 26th. I will turn it over now to Aaron to speak more on the policy's litigation and where it stands currently. Aaron, over to you.
Thank you, Selena. It is a pleasure to be here today. Since the Remain in Mexico program was initiated in 2019, it has been the subject of extensive litigation, both for people who were seeking to block the policy in court and by those who are seeking to keep the policy in place at the border. Litigation against the policy first began when individuals and organizations sued to force the Trump administration to end the policy, arguing that it was illegal, in violation of the law, because it led to people being sent back to Mexico without being given a chance to express their fear of persecution, and also on the argument that the program itself violated the Immigration and Nationality Act. Those lawsuits made it all the way up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and a panel of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that MPP was illegal, that the program violated the law and should not be continued. However, the Supreme Court stepped in and allowed the policy to stay in place while the case was argued in court. That meant that even though the policy was in place for quite some time, it wasn't blocked by a series of court orders that said using the policy was illegal. The case was set to be argued in front of the Supreme Court about whether or not the Remain in Mexico program was legal in 2021, but after President Biden took office, the Department of Justice agreed to essentially stop fighting that case, and the case was taken off of the court's docket because the Biden administration had terminated the program. That meant that the favorable court decision saying the policy was illegal effectively went away, because so did the program. And as of this date, the Supreme Court has never ruled on whether or not the Remain in Mexico program is legal. When Biden took office in January of 2021, the day of inauguration, the Department of Homeland Security suspended putting new people into Remain in Mexico. So as of January 1st, 2021, no new individuals were placed into the program. That left the question about what to do with all of the individuals who had already been sent back to Mexico, some of whom had been waiting at this point for 1 to 2 years for court hearings. And I'll note that court hearings for MPP 1.0 were suspended in March of 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. So from March of 2020 through January 2021, when new enrollments in the program were suspended, no court hearings went forward, and only a small number of individuals were actually sent back to Mexico and told to essentially wait indefinitely until the pandemic was over. Over the next few months, after President Biden took office, the Department of Homeland Security began what was known as the MPP wind down, when thousands of individuals were allowed to re-enter the United States and seek asylum from safety and not have to remain in northern Mexico. However, in April of 2021, a coalition of states led by Texas and Missouri, so 2 states sued the Biden administration, arguing that the temporary suspension of the Remain in Mexico program was illegal. In June, the Department of Homeland Security formally terminated the Remain in Mexico program, and the states who were suing to block the end of the program amended their lawsuit and challenged that June termination. But throughout the course of the spring and summer of 2021, the MPP wind down continued, and thousands more individuals were led into the United States and allowed to seek asylum and safety. That all changed in August of 2021, when federal judge Matthew Kacsmaryk of the Northern District of Texas declared that the Biden administration had violated the law by terminating the Remain in Mexico program without going through the proper procedures, and also ruled that the Remain in Mexico program was required by law, saying that essentially every single presidential administration since 1996, which is when the law that created the authority on which the Remain in Mexico program rests, so that every presidential administration since 1996 had been violating the law by not sending people back to Mexico to wait court hearings whenever the Department of Homeland Security did not have sufficient detention resources to lock up every person who crossed the border. This somewhat outrageous claim was immediately appealed to the Fifth Circuit and then all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court refused to step in and block this court order, even temporarily, saying in a 1-paragraph opinion in early September that essentially that they likely agreed that the Department of Homeland Security had not gone through the right procedures to end the program, hadn't considered the right factors, but explicitly didn't say anything about this incredible argument that MPP is required by law. Following that, the case continued through the appeals process, but the Biden administration was forced to reinstate the Remain in Mexico program because Judge Kacsmaryk's order, as Selena said, required them to reinstate the program supposedly in good faith. What that meant is that the Biden administration had to renegotiate with Mexico in order to create what became known as MPP 2.0, the second version of the program. Because this time around, they couldn't simply start sending people back to Mexico. They needed to actually go back to Mexico and say, hey, things have changed since we last negotiated this deal 2 years ago. Are you still going to allow us to send people back to Mexico? Because a key aspect of this entire program is that it relies on the cooperation of the Mexican government in order to be carried out. At one point, Texas and others tried to go to the court and say, Mexico, we don't need Mexico's permission, that the Department of Homeland Security could simply start sending people back to Mexico. And even Judge Kaczmarek said that's ridiculous. Quite obviously, this program relies on Mexico for its support. So as much as Texas has tried throughout this entire litigation to say that the Biden administration could resume to remain in Mexico without Mexico's permission, every single judge to have addressed that issue, even the ultra-conservative Fifth Circuit, has said that's absurd. Quite obviously, you cannot use this remain in Mexico program without Mexico's permission. So beginning in December, the Biden administration did reach an agreement with Mexico, and they essentially allowed the Biden administration to restart MPP 2.0, which, as you'll hear later, was substantially different in some ways and very similar in others. The key difference is that there were heightened vulnerability screenings so that certain, for instance, LGBT individuals are exempt from the program. And the Biden administration has said that individuals who are going to be sent back to Mexico have a greater chance to express a fear of persecution in Mexico that would allow them to avoid being sent back there. However, they also expanded the group of individuals that could be sent back to Mexico, adding, for example, Haitian migrants who had previously been exempt from MPP under the Trump administration, and saying if DHS chose to, they could send back Haitian migrants under MPP 2.0. So as the litigation continued at that point, right now in the lower courts, little is going on. MPP is back, and so right now all eyes are on the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case on a very shortened time frame because the Department of Justice indicated that this is a very serious case that they wanted the Supreme Court to hear this year rather than wait until fall of 2022, in which case you wouldn't get a decision until 2023. And the Supreme Court said, yes, we'll hear the case on a pretty rapid time frame. And in April, the case went to the Supreme Court. Importantly, what the Supreme Court was hearing was two questions only. Those questions were whether or not the law requires the Biden administration to use MPP. That is what that question was earlier. Has every presidential administration since 1996, when the law was created, been violating that law? And then the second question was whether or not the Biden administration, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals was correct to essentially ignore the Biden administration's second attempt to terminate the program following Judge Kaczmarek's initial decision that they had gone about it the right way. So in essence, the questions the Supreme Court heard were only about whether or not the Biden administration is allowed to end Remain in Mexico, but not whether or not Remain in Mexico is legal, whether it's a good idea, whether it violates international law or anything like that. This is purely a case right now about whether or not the Biden administration is legally allowed to end the program. And at oral argument, the Supreme Court justices, by and large, seemed to agree that the Biden administration probably can end the program. While, of course, it's impossible to predict how the Supreme Court is going to rule, there did appear to be at least 5 votes to support the idea that the Biden administration does, in fact, have the legal authority to end the program. There was a lot of skepticism for Texas's arguments that every other administration had violated the law. And although the justices did seem to be very frustrated with the Biden administration, that they are not simply locking up everyone who comes across the border, they didn't seem to be particularly convinced by Texas's argument that the Biden administration, if they can't lock up everyone crossing the border, has to send all of them back to Mexico. At one point, for example, when Texas tried to argue that the Biden administration didn't need Mexico's permission and they could just simply send people back to Mexico, Justice Kagan literally laughed at the Texas Solicitor General and said, what are they supposed to do? Just send busloads of people into Mexico without their permission? And so as a result, it seems likely that there will be a victory for the Biden administration, although at this point, again, it is far too early to tell. And there has been a sort of twist. After oral arguments concluded, a couple of weeks later, the Supreme Court asked for additional briefing on a question of jurisdiction. basically saying, hey, another provision of this 1996 law says that federal courts cannot issue injunctions that restrain the operation of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Now, for the last 25 years, what courts have taken that to mean is you just simply can't sort of, if the government is violating the law, you can issue court orders telling them to follow the law. But if the government is following the law, you can't issue court orders telling them to do something different. And this is a really complicated question of jurisdiction, but it could indicate potentially that the Supreme Court wants to narrow the number of immigration cases that it is hearing, because it's concerned about how judges are applying the law and essentially forcing the government to run the border, essentially how judges along the border are running immigration law for the government. We don't know what the court's going to do with that. It may be that they just simply ask for questions, ask for additional briefing, because a question was asked about that during oral arguments, and the Solicitor General of the United States said, we didn't brief this question, but we're happy to submit additional arguments on it. So this may have just been a very pro forma, we'll get back to you. And the Supreme Court said, okay, please get back to us. But the sort of short version of what happened at the Supreme Court is it does seem likely that the Biden administration will be allowed to make another attempt at ending the program. But what that means is even if the Biden administration wins in June, which is when we expect a decision to come in late June, even if the Biden administration wins, it doesn't mean that the Remain in Mexico program goes away overnight. That's because the next steps after a victory in the Supreme Court would be to send this case back to Judge Kaczmarek in Texas. And at that point, he is going to have to decide whether the Biden administration's second attempt to terminate the program, which came via a 39-page legal memo in October of 2021, was valid, and whether that satisfied the concerns that he had about the June termination memo that at this point has been, everyone has agreed was not sufficient and has been essentially set aside. So if the case goes back to Judge Kaczmarek to decide about what's going to go on with the October memo, there could be months more of legal arguments and briefs in the lower court. Judge Kaczmarek may want to hold another trial. He held a trial about the first hearing, the first memo, and it's possible he might want to hold another trial about the second memo. If they lose, if the Biden administration loses, then that goes back to the Fifth Circuit. If they win, then it still goes back to the Fifth Circuit, and they may overturn Judge Kaczmarek's opinion. And it's realistically speaking, what that means is that it is very unlikely that the Remain in Mexico program ends this year. It's possible it ends, if things go particularly rapidly, it's possible that they could get a positive decision allowing them to terminate the program by the end of 2022. But realistically, it seems most likely that this case is going to make it all the way back up to the Supreme Court, quite possibly in 2023. And that means that, sadly, even a victory at the Supreme Court in June likely means that Remain in Mexico is going to be with us for a little bit longer. And I think that's about it for litigation, and I will turn it back to Selena to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Aaron. That was a very helpful, very clear and succinct summary of a pretty complicated history. Definitely appreciate you doing that and giving us a little bit of your analysis as well. I will turn it over now to Marisol, who will be speaking to what MPP looks like on the ground while the policy is being litigated in the courts. It is having a very real impact on actual migrants. So Marisol, I invite you to speak to that and to your experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Selena. Thanks for having me. And thanks, Aaron, for all that information. Yeah, I'm here in El Paso, Texas, and I literally can see Mexico from my window. I can see a Mexican flag, and on a windy day, I can actually see it beautifully showing up. But unfortunately, I have far too many clients and thousands of others who are unable to get representation, stuck in shelters right now. Since 1.0 happened, basically, that's been the same thing. The process has been the same. I'll get into a little bit of the differences between 1.0 and 2.0 in a minute. But just to kind of give a regular explanation, they show up to the border, the bridge, seeking asylum, thinking that's something that's normal and legal and has been going on for decades. And then they're told either, nope, you can't come in under Title 42, or because of the country you're coming from, we're kind of forced to let you in through MPP. But for MPP, you're going to get a notice to appear, and you're going to have to come back to the bridge at 4 in the morning on the day of your hearing, and you're going to be piled up with a bunch of people. They put them in a bus, they drive them to the downtown courthouse, and there they're put in another room where they're tested for COVID. Once they go through that process, then they come upstairs to the courtrooms. And luckily, my organization, we also have a legal orientation program. So we have a few of our colleagues who are there to help the thousands that are not represented, to kind of give them guidance, help them with translations. I think that was a big difference between 1.0 and 2.0. We're there now, we weren't there before. Before, it was figured out on your own. If someone at the shelter is willing to help you, great. If not, people were coming to court, providing their asylum applications in their language, mostly Spanish, and this was being rejected. And so one way or the other, they just kept either continuing their cases or feeling like they were never going to be able to figure this out. And that's why a lot of people just stopped trying. And so I think that's one of the biggest differences. In 2.0, I feel there's a little more resources. And because there's not this big delay in COVID, rather than having them go back and spend months, then give them another notice of hearing months later, notice of hearing months later, this time around, they're actually getting their hearings heard pretty short, with short duration between their first hearing and their what they call the third. So they have their first master hearing, where they're basically given their rights and their NTA, their notice to appear, by the judge, and then they do what's called pleadings, where they deny allegations, or usually they just agree and accept their allegations that they are here without proper documentation, but they're seeking asylum. So then the judges give them an opportunity to go back to their shelters to fill out the asylum application and come up with whatever evidence they have. And then at the second master hearing, that's when the judge checks out their packet, sees if it is in English, if there is translations, if there is an asylum potential claim, and then schedules them for their third individual hearing. Now that third individual hearing is where they'll be asked to explain their situation in detail. If they have an attorney, that attorney will be able to prepare them and explain this process, and even help them write out the questions they're going to be asked, and get a closing argument prepared for them, submit more country conditions, just really make it a very good fat packet for the judge to understand fully the situation. If they're not represented, then they're at the mercy of, like I said, the legal orientation program, if they have time to help them. And also, they're limited in how much evidence they're able to get from their foreign countries. One of the other big differences is in 1.0, unfortunately, there was too many women that I would see. A lot of them were from Cuba, and a lot of these women were being raped while they were waiting for their court dates. And I had one female who was just brutally raped by a Mexican police officer. And her case just kept getting continued and continued. And when she started getting harassed by this police officer, she actually filed a claim against him at the police department. Of course, they're not going to do anything. But she took that report, she went back to the port of entry and said, please let me in. I'm being harassed. This is getting worse and worse and worse. And they kept denying her and telling her, nope, you got to wait for your court date. Well, because of COVID, her court date wasn't happening for months and months and months, until she was finally brutally raped and ended up being in the hospital having to have surgeries. But because of that, she missed her court hearing. It was the third one. This is the difference. They kept continuing them, whereas now they have a system. And so at that hearing that she missed, the judge ordered her removed in her absence. And so then that's when her journey got even crazier and worse, after she had already left Cuba because she was being tortured and abused there. She now had to deal with going back to Mexico and having this situation and not knowing how she was ever going to be able to convince anyone at the port of entry to allow her in, given that now she has an order in removal, to basically a deportation order in her absence. So she had to just find a way to sneak into the country, like they say, which of course they used that against her when she tried to reopen her case, and then was put in the detention center. When she was at the detention center, she tried to explain that she had asthma and that she fell under a class of people that are more vulnerable to COVID. And those got denied. Those requests to get parole got denied. So then she gets COVID. And due to COVID, she gets high blood pressure. And it wasn't until she had that that they finally decided we should probably let this lady out and let her figure out the next step in the court proceedings. So luckily we were able to, after being denied here locally by the judge in the immigration court twice to reopen her case, the Board of Appeals decided to agree with us, and they did reopen her case. And she's currently waiting to get adjusted through the Cuban Adjustment Act. So the ending has come to a better place, and it started for her. But as you can imagine, women like her started finding out how desperate the situation was and how violent Juarez is, that they started jumping the border wall, knowing that they would possibly be injured, very likely be injured. A lot of them ended up in the hospital where I had to represent them. A couple of them were nearly paralyzed when I had to convince CBP not to send them back to Mexico because they were pretty much paralyzed and unable to care for themselves. So I had to convince them to release them from her custody. And then ICE decided to not take them into custody because they didn't want to have to deal with the ongoing medical expenses. So now they're able to be out and here in this country to fight their asylum claim. But to imagine all they had to go through just to seek asylum. So that was 1.0. The problem was women were getting put in the situation. Luckily, I have not had a female. I've heard there was one possibly, but I have not had a single female client this time around. The majority of my clients this time around are from Nicaragua or Venezuela, and they're usually single men. So that's the good thing. We're not seeing families or women. Like some, I think it was Aaron that mentioned, one of the ways to get out of MPP is to request an interview that you fear to return in Mexico. So when someone comes to the court, they also have a way to do it at the port of entry. They can ask, can they please be re-interviewed to show that there's a special vulnerability that keeps them from being placed in MPP. The majority of that is the LGBT communities and other few very odd random stuff that convince. One of my clients had a individual hearing set up. So by now he's already been waiting for 4 to 5 months in Juarez. We have this great case set up for him. He's from Nicaragua, a student protester, has been beaten up, has proof of the recent threats to his life. But on the day of his hearing, the immigration judge had an emergency. So she continued his case. Luckily, he asked for a new interview. He had 2 days prior been assaulted at a store and had actually a scab on his face still. So he was able to prove the violence that he was continuously having to deal with in Juarez. So they did remove him from the program. They do call the attorneys if they're represented and allow them to be a part of the interview. As an attorney, you really don't get so involved in these interviews. It's more the questions to them directly and their explanations as to why they feel they should be removed from the program. I have seen a lot of success, so I do recommend everyone to ask for an interview, a new interview, especially if there's change in circumstances, like in this particular case. We have started having our individual hearings here in El Paso. Maybe three weeks ago they started, and there's 2 judges out of the 4 assigned to just hear MPP cases. I was actually very impressed by the judge that heard my case. She was very well, she had knowledge as to this country, knowledge as to the fact that the interpreter was making mistakes and was calling him out on her own. And she understood what my client had been through. She didn't prolong the case, and we were successful in that. As of yesterday here in El Paso, the program has now completely changed to where they moved to 8 courtrooms across the street in one of the old federal buildings here, where they're going to have every single MPP individual heard via video. And so they're expecting to have 8 hearings at 12 o'clock and 8 hearings at 2 p.m. every day. And these people will be in a courtroom where the judge will be in a video, not personally there, virtually. And these judges are from LaSalle or from Fort Worth. So they're jurisdictions that are not the best, but yesterday I found out there was 8 hearings. Out of the 8, 3 of them did not show up at all. They like one of those situations where they didn't think that they were going to make it, and why even keep staying around and trying. One of them got continued, and the 5 or the 4 that actually were heard, one did get granted asylum. So He was a student from Nicaragua, also very similar case to my client, the one I spoke about. Funny enough, they know each other. And I heard the story directly from my client after talking to him after his hearing. He felt that the judge was very understanding. So that is the big difference between 1.0 and 2.0, is that they're actually getting their hearings, they're actually being able to be heard, and there's not that many orders deported as there was. There's still very many because of the desperation that people get, and they get tired of hanging around and finding out what's going to happen next. The shelters in Juarez, it's not a good condition. There's 4 shelters in Juarez, and they've also started to use hotels now where they house the people that are forced to stay there. The 4 shelters are overcrowded. They do not offer proper treatment, medical treatment, and the food, it's very, it's not like they're not feeding them, but it's nothing that really is something that helps you continue to want to stay in a situation, in a condition like that. So I think that's one of the biggest struggles that I have with my clients. It's not so much me being able to represent them, because thanks to our cell phones and WhatsApp and emails, we're able to get the information across from the border to the next, but it's the conditions that they're living in and how it affects their mental health. Both of my recent clients had to go start seeing a counselor while waiting in Juarez, because already they're suffering with post-traumatic stress, but now being put in these conditions while they wait to find out their destiny. And the men that are coming from, especially Nicaragua, if they return to Nicaragua, it's not going to be anything less than torture, prison, death. I mean, that's the 3 options that they have, and that's why they usually choose exile. And so one of the shelters was so badly overcrowded that there was a man who actually died at the shelter. He was dead for 3 days. He had complained about his medical condition, but they were giving him the most simple over-the-counter headache kind of pill to just kind of shut him up. And so unfortunately, my client and a few other people started smelling something that they thought was a dead rat. They decided to follow the smell and found this dead body just laying there. And the way that the shelter dealt with it was covered up real quick. They used gasoline and diesel to kind of disinfect the area and get rid of the smell. And if the reporters who were on the other side of the fence tried to get any information from those at the shelter, they were either kicking them out of the shelter or punishing them. They put them in a little room where they intimidate them to sign that they would not release any information to the media, and didn't give them that option to think that they had that right to express what was going on. So a lot of them were just living in fear, not wanting to say anything. A lot of the men were getting kicked out of the shelters when they came back from the court, because they were afraid that you must have already gone to court and told them what's going on here. So they just automatically, you're not welcomed back. So a lot of these men have started their own type of camps at the different little plazas and parks in Juarez. And this is a way that they kind of protect each other from the violence in Juarez and the corruption from the cartel and the government. That's what's going on. The other questions, the challenges for myself, like I said, I think I'd always rather have more interaction with my clients, more one-on-one, but COVID has also played into that, affecting that. But to be honest, through WhatsApp, me and my clients, we communicate pretty much every day. Even the ones that have already finished their case are still letting me know how things are going. And we obviously hope that MPP ends. One thing I'm thankful about MPP is that they are at least giving a shot, because with Title 42, so many don't even get that shot. So I don't like MPP. I don't think it's humane. I don't think it's fair. I think it's wrong. I think it's trying to keep people from doing what they have the legal right to do, but at least they're given that opportunity to come to court and to have either myself and my colleagues represent them and figure out their stories and figure out how to help them get the evidence that they need, the medical records, the declarations from their family members, people who have knowledge as to what happened, get all the current reports available for the judge to be able to review the country conditions, and just to be there for them and to know and to show them that you can get through this. I think for them, just having somebody that's that they could trust has been really great for them. And I think the fact that we're able to represent people who either call us directly from the shelter or who are at the court seeking for assistance from the legal orientation program, it is frustrating because they start finding out that there is this help. And now, we get hundreds of calls a day and we have to tell them there's only so much we could do. So that is heartbreaking. I pretty much half of my day I'm a lawyer, and the other half I'm just having to say, no, I'm sorry, I can't staff your case. I can't accept your case. So that is why I hope that MPP ends, because then everyone will have that shot of having the time to hire an attorney or find another organization like mine who doesn't charge, but to have that a time to prepare and time to understand the system before just getting pushed either out or through without the proper assistance of an attorney. I really don't think anyone should have to face court, an immigration court, without representation. I think that's, for me, I feel like that's very necessary. So I had the pleasure of doing that and helping all these people and getting to know their stories. And like I said, we still connect afterwards. But that's pretty much what's going on here at the border. If you have any other questions, I'd be more than happy to answer anything else.
Thank you, Marisol. We really appreciate you, the work that you do, and thank you for that very sobering look at what MPP is like at the border. Now we will turn to Cecilia Suarez, who will give us an overview of what the policy looks like on the Mexican side and how that impacts asylum seekers in the country. Cecilia?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm going to share a presentation so that you have a little bit more of the images that can show more of what I'm going to share today with all of you. Well, I'm going to speak on behalf of our partners that are faith-based shelters located all over the country. And what I'm going to share with you today is how MPP looks like from the other side of the border. So, well, we all know since October 2018, when the first massive caravan arrived, more attention was paid to the increasing number of people in need and in desperation that attempted their luck traveling towards the north. The Migrant Protection Protocol has been one of the many recent changes and challenges that migration flows have experienced in the last 4 years in the region. Since then, since 2018, migrant shelters and services at the borders and along the country have been overcrowded and overflowed. When in January 2019, the MPP 1.0 started, conditions were already chaotic. We were starting with a new administration in Mexico with Presidente López Obrador. And I think his government was unprepared to fulfill the commitments agreed with the US government. The López Obrador administration has cut off all the support for civil society organizations, including shelters. And in theory, the government was taking over the humanitarian emergency, but without understanding the complexity of the problem and without designing a long-term strategy accompanied by adequate infrastructure. As Marisol was sharing, the chaos that the shelters have when the MPPs need to stay there for months, and during the pandemic for years. We can observe in this map the network of shelters that keep responding to the ongoing humanitarian emergency in the country. And they have been saturated and overcrowded since 2018. The Catholic Church has around 120 spaces providing humanitarian support for migrants, asylum seekers, and the increasing number of returnees. So changes in policies and regulations, the economic crisis, 2 years of pandemic, natural disasters, increasing violence, and desperation are some of the causes that keep people forcing to migrate. Even understanding the little possibilities that they have to succeed and acknowledging the challenges and dangers that they face in the largest and most dangerous border in the world. People keep coming to Mexico willingly to risk their lives and integrity along these 2,400 miles of border that they need to cross. The latest report produced by Redodem, it's a network of 24 Catholic shelters in Mexico. They have in the records services for migrants coming for 22 countries in 2020. So what is the day-to-day for asylum seekers waiting in Mexico? Well, I'm going to share the story of Juan Carlos. He is an asylum seeker from Peru. He was forced to run away due to political persecution. But when Juan Carlos was able to get finally a chance on the list to cross and have an interview with the US Immigration Authority, he was not prepared. He hadn't had the opportunity to have, as Marisol was appointing, legal assistance and legal advice. So when the authority questioned him about his well-funded fear of persecution in Mexico, he was just like not knowing what to answer, because he was prepared to tell his story about what was his fear of running away from Peru, but he was really surprised on this first question of the persecution in Mexico. So he was shocked, not able to answer, and they sent him back. So he's expecting to see what is going on to happen in the next interview. And he is in the Salvation Army shelter with other 53 men, waiting for another 45, 60 days for the next court hearing, if that is going to happen or not. Because they just don't understand the system. They don't understand what is going on, what sort of procedure it's awaiting them. So they really don't know what to expect. And they really feel very frustrated because some of the people that interview them don't take the time to really understand what is the issue that is taking them to this asylum application, and they feel that their cases are on the hands of one interview that in some cases was only one question, and their future depends on if the people was able to explain, they have the papers needed to be presented. So they are really very vulnerable. In 2019, around 77,000 migrants, asylum seekers, were returned on their MPP. Only 7.5% had access to legal services. And at the end, only 521 were granted relief. The pandemic left people trapped, and And since March of 2020, when the courts closed indefinitely, we have also the Title 42 coming on the top of all this situation. And with all these express deportations that have been ongoing for more than 2 years now, the situation is really complex at the border. Tijuana receives every day around 300 people under Title 42 that are mixed with all these MPPs cases. And so it's creating a very chaotic situation in the shelters, at the borders, with the authorities, that really creating a scenario where people cannot understand what are their possibilities, what are the options, what they need to do, who can help them, what is the realistic support that they can get. No? The National Immigration Institute provides people under MPP with a migratory form that allows them, in theory, to stay in the country for a year. But recently, we are seeing more and more people that need to pay and get involved into corruption to actually make the immigration authority to allow them to stay for the whole year. Because now they said to them that they can only stay for 90 days. And that is happening in Tapachula. So they are in the other side of the country with a 90 days permit. They need to get to the northern border without resources. So it's almost impossible that they will be able to do it in this short period of time. We have in Tijuana, there are 4 shelters that received MPPs for longer stays. The Centro Integrador para Migrantes, that it's run by the government, the Salvation Army, Un Desayunador Salesiano, and a hotel that was established for the pandemic, which serves people to spend 15 days so they are clear of COVID. These are the only 4 spaces designed for MPP in Tijuana. From January till April 2022, 458 people have been recorded into the MPPs in Tijuana, all of them men, with the exception of 3 women and no families. Only 150 of those 458 are remaining. The others have dropped their procedure. And the nationalities are Nicaragua, Colombia, Cuba, Ecuador, Peru, Venezuela, and Dominican Republic. Tijuana and Mexicali have 35 shelters in total, and they attend over 4,000 people. Today, they are at 80% of their capacity. That was the report they shared with me this morning. And this shelter that is run by the government now has 600 people. Mainly all of them are returnees under Title 42. And this Title 42 is really making things more challenging because that's the sort of population that are using the services provided at the border. And now in May, we start seeing Nicaraguans and Cubans that are now returned under Title 42. So that's something that is changing as well, no? The nationalities that Title 42 is entitling to return. Well, and I'm going to share the challenges and concerns expressed by our partners in Tijuana and Mexicali around MPP. I think the biggest one is the implication of longer stays. So people need to stay for at least 2 months using the services if they are lucky to have all the procedure as is planned. Shelters are saturated and they don't have resources to sustain the current demand. MPPs receive free services until they have their first appointment. But after they have the first appointment, the shelters start charging them fees for their accommodation. So that creates also a stress in the people, because now they need to pay, and obviously our border cities doesn't have medical services, doesn't have psychological support, and doesn't have working opportunities in place. So that creates also a lot of stress. Legal services are very limited, as I already shared, and there is not enough legal advice so that for people to really succeed in their applications. There is a lot of stress and anxiety as people need to stay for indefinite time without clarity, information about the possibilities. There is a lot of fear at the border. So the question of the immigration officer is correct. They fear for their lives in the Mexican side because almost all of them have been assaulted, abused, or they are in fear of having their persecutors coming for them. No, that's the other thing, that there is nothing that protects them in Mexico. And finally, as Marisol was sharing, these sad stories of people that get desperate and they just try to cross undocumented, putting their lives at risk, using more dangerous routes, and obviously without considering the repercussions that these decisions will take on in their own procedures, because it's like taking and dropping everything to the trash and risking their lives for almost sure nothing. No, and obviously the challenges that shelters are having managing this diversity of flows. We have Mexican people internally displaced growing, a lot of internal displays from Michoacán, Jalisco, Guanajuato due to the violence in the country, asylum seekers, Title 42 returnees, and obviously a lot of Mexicans that are deported. So the situation at the border is and has been chaotic for the last 4 years. And the continuous changes in asylum policies, in regulations, are generating more frustration, disorientation, and obviously there are opportunities for the organized crime to operate more successfully. No? So what we need is coordination. We need to acknowledge that the situation of the people claiming asylum is true. We need information, more information, updated information, and obviously we need legal support and a lot of through information and legal advice and attorneys that really accompany all these people in their procedures. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. That was very insightful. And thank you also for highlighting the needs that could potentially ease some of the stress for the people that are in the shelters. That concludes our webinar. I want to thank our panelists once again for joining us today, and also just for your tireless work and your commitment to asylum seekers and migrants and refugees. For those of you watching, I'd like to encourage you to check out the Justice for Immigrants website, as well as the DMRS, CRS, and the American Immigration Council's website for more resources on MPP and other immigration policies. And also on the JFI website, or Justice for Immigrants website, you can sign up for action alerts and to also receive bi-weekly newsletters where we share updates about MPP and other migration-related policies as well. Again, thank you so much to our panelists, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you.